We'll start off with Alexander Brodie Spark. Just who was Alexander Brodie Spark? Well, you can see his portrait here. This is an engraving kindly supplied by his great-grandson, Dr. Robert Spark. Spark was born in Elgin in Scotland in 1792, and he died in Sydney in 1856. As a young man of about 20, he went to London and worked his way up through the whole counting house shipping area to do well enough for himself to put together £1,000, get the necessary references, and get himself a land grant in Australia. He arrived in Australia in 1923, and he immediately, within 2 weeks, he had opened a store, he had brought goods with him to sell, and he was in business. He's important to historians because of his diaries. The diaries run from 1836 to very near the time of his death. And the original diaries are held today in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. They run to 600 plus handwritten pages. They're not quite complete. There are gaps, but they provide a pretty good record of the social and economic and commercial conditions in Sydney in that period. As well as being important to historians in general, they're very important to golf historians, because what they give us is the first reliable evidence of golf being played in Sydney in 1839. Now, when I say reliable evidence, I'm referring to what historians would call primary source evidence. His diaries are a contemporary document. They're written not only by an eyewitness to the golf, but a participant in the golf. And we can take Spark as being a reliable witness because he was just very respected in Sydney. At the time the diaries begin, he's building his beautiful house in Tempe House. This is 1936, and you can see the picture of Tempe House here, understated elegance. He was a man of taste. He had a great art collection. He was a patron of the Botanical Society. He actually was instrumental in starting the subscription library, which I believe has morphed into the State Library. He was also instrumental in getting the church, the Anglican church at St. Peter's, built. I believe it was the first Anglican church in Sydney. He was a very, very successful entrepreneur. He became very wealthy. As well as his store, which was in George Street, he was into banking, shipping, part ship owner, gaslight company, auction house, and other things as well. Now, Spark first came to the attention of the general public with a publication in 1976 by Abbott and Little called The Respectable Sydney Merchant. Now, this is a scholarly work and contains transcriptions from the diary. The diaries first came to the attention of golf historians with an article published by David Innes in 1992. Now, this is groundbreaking work by Innes and is a very important step in Australian golf history. Contradicting that somewhat, I'm going to point out some of the shortcomings in the Innes article. Firstly, by publishing in a popular golf magazine, there was not a reference list to sources of evidence. Now, this would be an editorial choice, I think, rather than a choice of the author. And Innes stated that there were only 5 entries referring to golf in all the diaries. This turns out to be incorrect. Norman and I made a decision to read the diaries in their original, all 600 plus pages, and what we found out very quickly that there were more than 5 entries. There were in fact 10. And these extended for a very short period, from the 25th of May to the 17th of August in 1839. And when we read the manuscript, we realized that Abbott and Little, as they said in their introduction, They didn't transcribe every single word in the diaries, and some of the entries they cut short. The important thing that we found out by reading the diaries, as far as those 10 entries were concerned, is we knew a lot more about who played golf, which Innes did not know. The other shortcoming is that Innes was very enterprising. He contacted the historians of Royal Blackheath in London, and they gave him an extract from the archived minutes of Royal Blackheath for a meeting of the club on the 2nd of October 1841. I'll read this to you in full. The secretary presented a gallon of claret from the captain of the New South Wales Golf Club, Alexander Brodie Spark, Esquire, on the occasion of a birth of a son and heir, when the health of Mrs. Spark and the young golfer was drank with all the honours. Field Marshal Lindsay proposed, and Captain Cameron seconded, that A.B. Spark, Esquire, be henceforth an honorary member of this club, which was carried unanimously, and the secretary was requested to announce the same to him. The problem was that Innes presented this quotation without comment, and it is really quite astonishing. One has to ask oneself, why was Spark made an honorary member of the Royal Blackheath Golf Club in London? Now, back to the diaries. Golf was played and recorded by Spark from the 25th of May to 17th of August. That's a very short period of time. Because he was made an honorary member of Royal Blackheath in 1941, we can reasonably say that golf was played beyond 1839, but my impression is that it was not played with the same regularity or intensity. We focused our research on 3 puzzles which we thought needed some answering. And these puzzles are: what triggered the start of golf on the 25th of May, 1839? I'll read that extract to you from the diaries. 25th of May. Captain Ferrier and Messrs. George and Adam Wilson commenced operations at Grose Farm on behalf of the golf club. I will read the second entry for you. 1st of June. The New South Wales Golf Club instituted. Many members in the field. Played my first game with Mr. Duguid. Gave a small dinner on the occasion, at which were present Captains Ferrier and Murray, Mr. Duguid, Messrs. John and William Brown, Messrs. George and Adam Wilson, and Mr. Alexander. These are the most important diary entrants as in terms of what we can learn about the golf played at that time. Now, starting from 25th to 17th of August, very, very short period, and we know from newspaper reports that by 1844, the golf played at Grose Farm was completely forgotten. So, first puzzle, what triggered the golf in 1839? Second puzzle, why did it have such a short life? And the third puzzle, and the greatest puzzle of all, is why on earth was Spark made an honorary member of Royal Blackheath? What was the connection between those Grose Farm golfers and Royal Blackheath? And I should point out to you a little bit about Grose Farm. It was at that time used as government paddocks and for a few other purposes. It was situated on land that is now occupied by Sydney University, Royal Prince Alfred Hospital and Victoria Park. And you can see on the illustration a painting showing the first stages of Sydney University on the skyline, dead centre. You can see a little bit of Grose Farm in the front of it, And of course, Grose Farm extends behind Sydney University. That image is actually taken from looking down the old Parramatta Road from Annandale, near the old toll. Right, now let us set about how we solved the puzzles. I'm going to talk about three key people. Captain Ferrier, who's mentioned in the diaries. Captain Ferrier was the captain of the Lady Fitzherbert, which happened to be in port at the time. Second important person didn't actually play golf at Grose Farm. It was John Masson, and he was Spark's shipping agent in London. And the third person is one of the others mentioned on the 25th of May, Adam Wilson. He was a friend and business associate of Spark. Now, what do the diaries tell us about Masson? They do tell us that he was more than just a London agent. He was a friend from Elgin. Spark bought and sold land in Australia on his behalf. He visited Spark in Australia in 1848. And when Spark died, they were still friends, even though Masson owed Spark the large sum of £1,053. About Captain Ferrier, from the diaries, we know that he met Spark for the first time in October 1838, when he arrived with the Lady Fitzherbert. Now, Spark made a point of meeting Captain Ferrier, and during his stays in Sydney, he socialised with Spark a great deal, stayed overnight with Spark, dined with Spark. But after he arrived in 1838, he was immediately dispatched to Mauritius to buy sugar. And this is where you have to read the original diaries to discover that Spark took a share in that venture. A moiety, it was called, a share normally denoting a half share. Spark gave Ferrier £300 and said, go and buy some sugar and bring it back to Sydney. And no doubt they made a tidy profit out of that venture. In May 1841, Ferrier was back in Sydney. He had a different ship, a much larger ship called the Busara Merchant, and he was in a position to sell Spark 7 out of the total of 64 shares in the ship. So Captain Ferrier and Spark were quite close. The other person to mention is Adam Mawson. We don't know much about him from the diaries, except that he was a friend and associate, business associate of Spark. Now we go on to find out more about these three people from other sources. And I'll start off with John Masson. And here we have a real eureka moment in the research journey. We knew Masson was his shipping agent and his friend. And in a thoughtful moment, I had the history of Royal Blackheath in front of me. I browsed through it here and there, picked up bits of information about Royal Blackheath. And I thought, well, I'll look up the index and see if there's any mention of Masson. And that was a real eureka moment. Not only was Masson a prominent member of Royal Blackheath, over the years from 1827 to 1844, he was the captain for 1 year and the secretary for the whole of that period. Masson was an important person in Royal Blackheath. And if I can remind you, who presented the gallon of claret on behalf of A.B. Spark? It was the secretary. It was his friend, his shipping agent, John Masson. In a way, we've established the Blackheath connection, and we could have left it at that, but we will go a little further in establishing that connection. And that takes me to Captain Ferrier. When he arrived in Sydney and played golf in Sydney, he was captain of the Lady Fitzherbert. And here is another eureka moment. I can't remember exactly what I keyed into Google, but up came the Derbyshire Records Office. Quite a surprise. And their catalogue showed me that they held a letter from John Masson to Sir, I think it's Henry Fitzwilliam. Letters from Captain James Ferrier to Fitzherbert. So we used the research services of the Derbyshire Records Office, and they were extremely helpful. We got a facsimile of the letter from Masson to Fitzherbert, and we got poor facsimiles and some transcripts of the letters from Ferrier to Fitzherbert. First of all, the letter from Masson was announcing the death of Captain James Ferrier in Mangalore in India in 1844. And the letter made it clear that Ferrier was a cousin of John Masson. There was one letter in particular from Ferrier to Fitzherbert announcing the sale of the Lady Fitzherbert and the purchase of the Busara merchant. And that letter told us something about Ferrier. He wasn't a rough old sea dog. He wrote well, and he addressed Fitzherbert, a member of the gentry, in cordial terms. Now those two leads to Masson and Ferrier made us search further, and another great eureka moment. You can get copies of British wills from the National Archives in Britain, and it's really quite amazing. You go to their website, you key in Captain James Ferrier, died 1944, and you send them £3.50, and within 2 minutes you have a facsimile of Captain Ferrier's will. The key thing for us was it told us that Ferrier was living at Blackheath. And we confirmed that from the electoral roll of 1837, and we confirmed that from the England census of 1841. Now, Captain Ferrier, living at Blackheath, the only golf course outside of Scotland, and probably Ireland, I should say, he had to be a golfer. His cousin was the secretary. He just had to be a golfer. The next step in our research journey was to visit the National Library of Scotland and the Royal Blackheath Golf Club. The National Library of Scotland holds a very rare book by Hughes, published in 1897, giving extracts from the Royal Blackheath minutes from their beginnings until 1897. In addition, Royal Blackheath has a very substantial collection of his archives going back to 1787. They are not complete by any means, but I spent quite a few days at Royal Blackheath and ploughed through the archives, and what I discovered is that when Captain Ferrier was not at sea, he played at Royal Blackheath on at least 80 occasions. He and his brother, Charles, were made honorary members at Blackheath in November 1834. Captain Ferrier is often listed as a member or an honorary member, but in February and March of 1838, he was actually chairing meetings of the members. So he was an active golfer, an enthusiastic golfer, and a very prominent member of Royal Blackheath. The third connection to Blackheath is Adam Wilson. And we actually discovered this quite early on, because in 1844 he attended the Mayor of Sydney's fancy dress ball, and he was dressed as a Blackheath golfer. Golfers in those days wore quite elaborate uniforms, so he would have stood out. And when we ploughed through the Blackheath archives, we found that he was registered as a member in 1834 and again in 1840. So, what have we done towards solving the three puzzles? I think we can reasonably assume that the arrival of Captain Ferrier, enthusiastic golfer, in the Lady Fitzherbert, and he arrived in May 1839, we can assume that he would have carried his golf clubs and his golf balls with him and played golf wherever he could. Now remember, in 1839, you didn't need a golf course to play golf. You played golf on whatever land was available. So we think that Captain Ferrier was the trigger that started golf in 1839. And we think the active period was while Captain Ferrier had his extended stay in Sydney. He had a long stay. He didn't leave Sydney until September that year because he simply couldn't get a crew. He seemed to have organised his cargo and his passengers, but he couldn't get a crew. And I think that after he left, golf gradually began to peter out. Now the third mystery, the connection to Blackheath. Before we began our research, there was no real evidence of why the 1839 golfers at Grose Farm had a connection to Blackheath. But I think we've proved over and over again, quite convincingly, that it was no accident that Royal Blackheath made Spark an honorary member. Spark was well connected to Royal Blackheath, particularly through his close friends Captain Ferrier and John Lassen and Adam Wilson. I think that's enough from me. We'll now have some questions. So they can be picked up on the microphone. I will repeat the first question. The question is, could Spark be regarded as the founding member of golf in Australia? I think you could make out a case for that, but really I think that honour should go to Captain Ferrier. The reasons are that Norman and I ploughed through Spark's letters to his father when he was in London. We ploughed through his journal, which he kept while he was in London. These are in the Mitchell Library. And we found no evidence of Spark going out to Royal Blackheath and having a game with his friend John Masson. And ploughing through the Blackheath archives, we could find no mention of Spark during the time he was in London or during the time he was in Sydney, other than awarding him the honorary membership. So all the evidence is that Spark was not a golfer, and that is enhanced because in reading the letters to his father and his journal, he describes a visit to Scotland during his stay in London, and he visits Aberdeen, he walks across the links. He doesn't mention golf. We know golf was played on the Aberdeen links at that time. He visits Dornoch, an important golfing centre, and golf was never mentioned. So we think Captain Ferrier is the best candidate for the founding father of golf in Australia. The question was, is there any truth in the claim that Captain Ferrier was the great-great-grandfather of Jim Ferrier, the Australian-American professional golfer who won the US PGA Championship in 1947, a very prominent figure in golf? My answer to that is we know that claim has been made, and Norman and I have done some digging. Particularly Captain Ferrier's will, we discovered his wife's name was Frances. From her will and from census records, we know that her maiden name was Dick. From the census, from the two wills, there's no evidence of children surviving to adulthood. So the absence of children would rule out the connection from Captain Ferrier down to Jim Ferrier. But more than that, the original claim had Captain Ferrier married to a woman called Elizabeth Crawford. And We have primary source evidence that he was married to Frances Dick. Norman and I have been trying to reconcile these two accounts of Captain Ferrier. We haven't had much success. I have grave doubts about the claim that Captain Ferrier started a dynasty that ended up with Jim Ferrier, champion golfer. The question was, how many holes were played at Grose Farm? Well, my answer to that is we simply don't know. We don't even know exactly where golf was played on Grose Farm. Grose Farm is quite a large area. We're fairly certain it would be played on the high ground because at the time they used feathery balls which did not take kindly to a wetting. They would avoid the low, swampy areas and keep to the dry, high areas. What we have to remember about golf in those days is 18 holes was not the standard. Golf in Scotland at Leith and at Burgess, Bruntsfield that is, at that period they were played over 5, sometimes 6 holes. Royal Blackheath played over 5 holes. We really don't know how many holes, and we don't know that much about how the golf was played. We can be fairly certain that the rules they played to, before the rules were standardised internationally, were the rules of Royal Blackheath, because Captain Ferrier, we feel sure, would have carried a copy of the Blackheath rules with him. The question was, what is the oldest golf club in the world? And I have to answer that by saying establishing the oldest golf club anywhere is an absolute minefield. If you go by the standards of a professional historian, the standards used by the British Golf Museum at St Andrews, you have to use primary source evidence of the existence of the golf club. And from that date, you can say the golf club existed. Most golf historians, and the British Golf Museum for that matter, would award that honour to the Honourable Company of Edinburgh Golfers. And they, in 1784, they decided to hold an Open Championship. So for the first time, they had to publish some rules. Before that, they would all know the rules without having to write them down. So they published some rules in 1744. They managed to persuade the City of Edinburgh Council to present them with a silver club as a trophy, and the City of Edinburgh published the conditions on which they would present the trophy. And if you're at the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, you can actually see these original rules, not a facsimile. You can see the original rules and the records of the City of Edinburgh in 1744. Are there any more questions? I think not. So I would like to thank everybody here for letting Norman and I share our knowledge. I know Norman knows more about some things than I do, and I know more about some things than he does, but we've both worked on this project together, and I would remind you that you can pick up a copy of the full research article before you leave. There are hard copies at the side of the room. Thank you very much.